Welcome back to the Trauma in the Brain podcast. I'm Chantel Tilly Anderson. We define trauma as an event or experience that changes a person's view of themselves or the world. We looked at how it overwhelms the nervous system and causes a fight, flight, or freeze response. Today, we're expanding that conversation to explore trauma as a life experience. How do our responses show up in our daily lives, across the lifespan, and even in our health? Today, joining me is Matt Laszlo. For the sake of clarity, the first thing I want to focus on is distinguishing or differentiating between the word trauma describing a traumatic life event and then using trauma to describe the body's trauma responses. Can you differentiate between those and help me clear that up so I understand and follow it better?
Yeah. The trauma as a life event is pretty hard to describe one standard answer. Typically what we think of with trauma is some form of abuse or significant life event that alters your perception, very commonly with the threat of dying. So overturns on the fight or flight system because it has to activate to manage the situation to create, there's typically the perception of unsafety. Trauma as the body's response is the fight or flight system activates. I would say more often than not overwhelms. We talked last time about the fight, flight, or freeze. Typically, it's when the freeze response comes in and you have partial or complete dissociation that trauma becomes a thing. Essentially, for something to become traumatic, it has to be that the brain can't quite integrate it into long-term memory. There's a lot of research on the way traumatic memories are stored different than regular bad memories. So that moves into a whole lot of neurological stuff, but essentially overwhelming the fight or flight system. You got a freeze response, partial dissociation, floods of adrenaline, cortisol, and an inability to integrate the experience into long-term memory.
Great, thank you. How do trauma responses or symptoms show up in daily functioning, like in relationships? I guess let's start there with relationships or work.
Well, so the way I wanted to put this one is sort of connecting the academic with the real life practical of trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, there's three categories of symptoms: intrusive thoughts and re-experiencing, avoidance coping, and negative changes in cognitions or moods, cognition being the way we think. The intrusive thoughts and re-experiencing most commonly refers to flashbacks. That's an actual re-experience. That's different than reflecting on a past experience. A flashback is when it floods in, usually externally triggered, some reminder brings it on, and now I'm reliving the trauma. But the intrusive thoughts that I like to talk about is, we said last time, trauma negatively affects our view of ourselves, our view of the world, or both. Day-to-day functioning, if one of the situations you want to use as relationships is, if I have a history of trauma, childhood particularly, abuse, that made me feel like I'm not good enough, I'm unlovable, unlikable. Well, now you fast forward years later, I'm in a relationship, I'm dating, and kind of constantly have these intrusive thoughts that this is not going to work out, this can't possibly go well. What if anxieties are coming up all the time. And with a fight or flight response, there's physiological hypervigilance, hyperarousal, because it really feels like this can't go well. And it's not just the normal day-to-day jitters of, what if I spill something on my clothes during our date? It's more significant than that. It comes with the physical. Avoidance coping is, I think, probably the most common symptom of PTSD, but it's also, unfortunately, the hardest to catch. We don't recognize it very often because memory reconsolidation is a modality that I really like. And the term they use for it is conscious justifications. Go ahead.
Can you explain what a modality is?
Yeah, different treatment options. You have EMDR, memory reconsolidation, cognitive behavioral therapy. A modality is just a specific type of intervention.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Conscious justification. So kind of an academic term for a good excuse is what they're referencing. But where it's not just the same as an excuse is when the fight or flight system is feeling that feels wrong to go do something, then we have to kind of create a narrative for why. But the act of bringing up a trauma over and over again is uncomfortable, and our brain doesn't want to do that. It's overwhelming. So what it does is tries to build a truth around that. Well, I'm unlikable, unlovable, worthless becomes the narrative, and then I tell myself all the reasons why it can't work on top of that. So it's like, well, they probably going to find you interesting. I don't tell myself I'm worthless, and I definitely don't tell myself it's from my childhood trauma. I just say that statement, it feels true, and then I don't do it. I don't act on it.
Can you delve deeper into intrusive thoughts? I think, from my understanding, just interacting with people on the internet, I've seen a lot of people, it's like both ends or both extremes. So some people are like, oh, I have this intrusive thought every morning. I have to go get coffee. So they don't understand what that means. And then you have other people who really understand what it means, but it's the other extreme to the point where, like, we don't talk about those thoughts that pop in your head. And thoughts are just from the get-go something that just pops in that you didn't expect to pop in your head.
Yeah, that's a part of it, but typically it's considered unwanted. Nobody say that again.
Is it also repetitive?
Most commonly, yes, but not. It doesn't have to be. An intrusive thought may not be. And especially as you're going through life with unresolved trauma, it's going to come up in new ways. So childhood trauma starting at 8, you don't get your first boyfriend or girlfriend until you're 17, and now you're having new intrusive thoughts because there's never been that context necessarily. So, and that's part of the problem is in terms of connecting it to your trauma is it's like, well, I'm just having these intrusive thoughts and, don't take the time to go, I wonder if this is from what happened to me when I was 8. So again, the avoidance is a big component of it, avoiding reminders, triggers, but also to some extent reminding things that are uncomfortable, even if I don't know why. And that's something to pay attention to, which I'll save that for later. But then the last one being the negative changes in cognition or irritability, depression, anxiety, different things like that. The two that I always like to use because they're so easy to remember, practical application, is fear and shame. Shame is not considered a core emotion, but we've all experienced shame. I love Brene Brown's work. Guilt is I did something wrong. Shame is there's something wrong with me, right? I am bad. And that's very much connected to trauma. I don't want to, it's hard for me, a cognitive therapist, to say always, but very, very, very rarely is shame not connected to some type of trauma because that's not our natural state, right? My 3-year-old and 6-year-old don't think of themselves in bad ways. They don't think I'm bad. They don't think that I'm worthless and can't succeed. It's just not natural. That has to be learned through typically something pretty significant. And then the fear looks like hyperarousal, hypervigilance, constantly worrying, and actually feeling that fear response.
So zoom in on medical traumatic events, or medical trauma, as it's often called, and their effects on the mind and daily habits. So hospitalizations, surgeries, maybe ICU experiences.
Mm, I had lumped that one in with TBI and didn't do anything on it, but I'll speak to it very briefly. Um, a lot of times that's because we're going in for a medical condition, right? But where medical trauma can become a thing, not necessarily accounting for when things go significantly wrong, the botched surgery and that kind of thing. Um, Helplessness and hopelessness, the act of giving complete total control of my health to somebody else because the diagnosis and prognosis is so bad, um, can pretty lends itself very well to trauma because I am not in control. Negatively affects my view of myself. I'm not good enough. I did something wrong. I deserve this. Um, or the world. I'm not safe in this world. I'm not in control, and anything can happen. And now I'm completely giving trust to somebody else that's never going to feel safe or good or comfortable.
And oftentimes we don't know those individuals, the healthcare professionals or whoever we're handing our life over to. When I started my journey to healing, and I went into a psychiatric treatment center for my bipolar disorder. And I remember in that moment, as I was signing paperwork to kind of like sign myself in, I had to really take a leap of faith and trust in these individuals with my life. And I kind of had to hand over that weight to somebody else. And that was really scary. And it brought up a lot of stuff from my childhood of being powerless or just not knowing what to do.
Right.
Because nobody knew what to do. My support system at the time, it had gotten so bad, nobody knew how to help.
Mm-hmm. Well, and if we're talking about psychiatric hospitalizations, that's potentially traumatic in a whole lot of different ways that I think are worth maybe noting, and I'll speak to. And it's sort of could go a lot of different directions because I think that there are inherently still some problems in managed healthcare with the way we deal with these types of issues. Um, Being hospitalized for a psychiatric condition, everybody there perceives it as we're just trying to help. The person being checked into the hospital feels like there's something wrong with me. You're, you know, I'm the problem, and now I'm being locked up. And what are you going to take away? What are you going to change? What are we working on? As opposed to somebody with a broken leg very much wants to get checked into a hospital. They know what's wrong. They can see it. And the doctor says, we're going to set that. We're going to help. Well, yeah, I want that. With a psychiatric hospitalization, it's significantly different. The person does not know what they're going to be doing, doesn't know if they even want them to, and it feels like you're working on me. Now, we're not. Cognitive behavioral therapy 101 is externalizing the problem, right? You're not the problem. You are not bipolar. But there's just not enough intentional effort more often than not to let the person know that when they're in the middle of it. And that's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate. I knew what I was walking into because I did have experience working in psychiatric hospitals. And so I had a really interesting perspective when I went into that. And it was a weird helplessness, powerlessness, but I almost had to take a step back and look at it like, okay, if it was me taking care of me, would I trust me?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that's kind of how I did it, and it worked. But like giving up my phone for 2 months and no
Right.
internet and only phone calls at certain times, you really, it's strange how you have to relearn boundaries. And that's one of the first things they decide to teach you is like you have to reset your energy and you have to kind of cut yourself off and restart and then rebuild it back.
Mm-hmm.
How does trauma in childhood differ from trauma in adulthood? Can it look different in the way people respond?
Yeah. Um, the very simple answer is yes. It's typically pretty different response from childhood to adulthood. The start is my view of myself. And that's because of the egocentric mindset that kids have. I always use the example, my 6-year-old, because this was literally in my developmental psychology class, first one I took, and then I saw it when I had my kids. My 6-year-old walking down the street, zigging and zagging, look, Dad, the moon is following me. Well, it's adorable, but it's wrong. The moon is not following him. But that egocentric mindset that I control things when trauma happens is significantly problematic. There's huge disruption because it has to be me. Albert Ellis coined the term masturbatory thinking. It must be me. There must inherently be something wrong with me if my mom is not taking care of me, if my dad is abusing me, if this neighbor is hurting me and nobody's doing anything about it. So very, very commonly, it's the view of the self that is negatively impacted with childhood abuse. If you have trauma in adulthood with no childhood trauma, it's more commonly, and these are very stereotypical presentations, I'm describing the extremes, you're going to have more of a view of the world. The world is unsafe. It wasn't my fault that that tourist came flying through that intersection and didn't stop at the stoplight and hit me. It's theirs. But that's equally scary because I have no control. So those are the two ends of the spectrum where childhood and adulthood trauma plays itself out differently. The second thing is, how much do we have more of an experience with fight or flight systems before the freeze happens? Parents, or excuse me, not parents, adults in general have much more access to fight and flight opportunities and systems. So for a freeze or a dissociation to happen in adulthood, absent any childhood trauma experiences, that's going to be a pretty significant event, right? Whereas with kids, it could be significantly less. So that's where the question, can any event be traumatic, or how big does an event have to be? Well, obviously, to some extent, that depends on how old you are and what access you have to resources, coping skills, strategies. And the more of those you have, the more significant the event is going to have to be to create trauma.
Can you talk about the ACEs study?
I
We
can.
covered it in the first episode. Well, we tried to, and our audio cut out. So, can you start from the top and explain what it means and what it found and why it's so important?
Yeah. The ACEs study stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And I had to go back and relook it up. I reference it all the time and couldn't remember exactly when it was, but it was in the early 90s. Kaiser Permanente was doing some research and studies on how trauma affects health throughout the lifetime. I believe Dr. Felitti was the head of that. He did the continuing education. I learned most of the stuff from it, but they interviewed tens of thousands of people for this study, and then compiled the data to show, does trauma affect physical health throughout the lifetime? Resounding, unequivocally, the answer was yes. It does, and in almost every way we can think of. They had 10-question questionnaire. They didn't want to make it real significant, and they didn't want to try to rule anything out for the sake of trauma. What is trauma? So they had just 10 questions, and they related to abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. So household dysfunction, they asked the question, does anybody in the home have mental illness? is anybody abusing substances. Typically that comes with abuse. And then abandonment, neglect, those types of things. And then for the abuse category, they had physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. So what I kind of wrote down is these things affect our health both directly and indirectly. Indirectly, what I typically use to explain that is people with trauma are much more likely to use tobacco, nicotine, alcohol, other drugs. Well, we know those things are not good for our physical health. And so those are impacting your health, not directly the trauma itself, but obviously those effects. But it's also directly. They directly affect physical health because it disrupts physiological functioning. The physical body should not be in a constant state of fight or flight. That's not good for functioning. It disrupts things. You've got chemicals that are being released that are not supposed to be being released. Your digestive system, GI tract, is like the number one thing that people start to notice, right? GI distress. For little kids, constant tummy aches, headaches, always exhausted. Well, those are signs and symptoms that there might be some trauma. The other things they mentioned, muscle tension, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, but all the way up to cardiovascular disease. Trauma negatively affects our physical health. But I also always like to add that's unresolved trauma, not resolved trauma. Because if we only look at it as trauma, it negatively affects health, it starts to look pretty dire, pretty bleak. But you see these significant interventions early on where trauma doesn't affect people throughout the lifespan. The creation of things like trauma-focused CBT, early interventions, not the same long-term health effects. So there is hope regardless of how significant the ACEs score is. And the higher the ACEs score, obviously the higher prevalence of physical health problems.
So it's scored based on your dose of stress?
The ACEs score? Nope, the number of traumas you had.
Okay.
So if my dad hit me and my mom was an alcoholic, then that's 2 out of 10. If I also had sexual abuse from somebody else, that's 3. It's literally just a 0 to 10 score.
Okay, so I guess it doesn't necessarily cover compound trauma or distinguish anything like that. It just decides, hey, this person might have some stuff that happened that's affecting them now.
Right. Yeah, and it's actually a really good, you can find them anywhere, the questionnaire in PDF form and different things. It's worth looking at because very often you ask people, do you have trauma? I don't think so. Then they take the ACEs score and it's 7 out of 10. And it's like, well, I guess I do, which it might be because it's not affecting them anymore, or it might just be because they've never had the terminology, the narrative, the realization that it was trauma.
So the other day, after our last episode, when I realized that the ACEs stuff was cut out, I was so sad. I had to look it up. I did my own research and was like reading about it.
Mm-hmm.
But my husband had never heard of it. And I had the opportunity to explain it to him and actually walk him through it. And we did that for him.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, wow, I never considered any of these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they did a really good job with the study and making the questions very simple to answer, very easy to recognize.
It's very plain English, just basic. Yeah. Okay. What connections do we see between trauma, PTSD, and long-term health outcomes? How can unresolved trauma affect the body over time? Do you feel like we covered that already?
I do, but I can speak to it a little bit more. Physical functioning is negatively affected, right? Like if my fight or flight system is constantly going off, you've got constant tensing and untensing. That's not good for the muscles. That's not good. You get pretty significant headaches, right? Stress headaches are a thing. Pretty strong connections to migraines. I don't know that there's anything out there that necessarily says migraines are from trauma. In fact, I don't. I think they're pretty notable medical conditions associated with it, but significantly makes it worse, right? It's disrupting natural blood flow, natural airflow, because typically we go, and then we're like this for a very long time, which drives the blood pressure up, drives heart rate up. And so physically it's affecting us in profound ways. And the other thing I talk about with people a lot, and this is less research evidence-based type stuff, but it's exhausting. And when the physical body is that exhausted, you're more likely to get sick. You don't have the capacity to fight off regular illness, which is why I think in the ACEs continuing education course I took years ago, that they talked about unresolved trauma makes you more likely to get everything from the common cold to cancer, because your body just can't fight it. It's just worn down. Even if we look at the million different ways it affects it, how many people with unresolved trauma get good night's sleep? Not very many. And sleep is where our body is restored, healed, and all those kinds of things. So the domino effect of how unresolved trauma affects our health is so significant. I always tell people that working at an integrated care clinic, how much can your physical health improve by resolving trauma? It's hard to answer, but it's significant. Like how much it'll improve, we don't know, but it's worth finding out. I don't know that it was necessarily associated with the ACEs study, but I believe it was the same medical company, Kaiser Permanente. A woman wrote a letter to them called Dear Doctor. And in it, she talks about all the medical conditions she had, all the treatment she got from just a purely medical standpoint, one of which was a heart murmur, which was considered incurable, untreatable. And when she eventually, as an adult, got into therapy, and particularly trauma therapy, and started working through some things, all her physical conditions improved, including her heart murmur. That's pretty significant. Now, I don't know that that's a common presentation. In fact, I would say probably not. But it's so profound how trauma affects our physical bodies, which for me offers a lot of hope, because resolving the trauma can significantly improve any health condition, whatever you're struggling with, whether it's fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, headaches, body aches, illnesses. You heal the mind, and the body's capacity to heal grows exponentially.
I've never read it, but I've heard about the book called The Body Keeps the Score.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who wrote it. Do you?
Yeah, that's Bessel van der Kolk.
Okay.
Yeah, and he's brilliant. So I tell people anything by him, you're pretty safe read. But yeah, it's good. I actually have not read his, because there's another one called The Body Remembers by Babette Rothschild, and I love her book. She's one of my favorites, and it's a little bit more practical. I started to read the Body Keeps the Score, and it was brilliant, but I didn't see it having a lot of application helping me out as a therapist. And hers is more specifically geared to therapists. But I think for someone with trauma, that book could potentially be a good read, because it really validates what's going on and can kind of help you see how trauma plays itself out in the physical body. When we were talking earlier about looking for symptoms, I don't think people very commonly go looking at their physical issues as having trauma connections, but very often they do.
Well, it wasn't until you said it that I realized I have one that I do commonly. I hold my breath all the time out of like anxiety or nervousness, anticipation.
Mm-hmm.
And then I realize, oh, I haven't breathed in a few minutes,
Right.
I have to stop and exhale and yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a couple more things that I want to go over. I have one more thing that was on our outline. And then I wanted to go over boundaries with you. I feel like we could talk about
Sure.
boundaries forever.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
I just need to, so first steps towards healing. What's a first step someone can take if they're beginning to recognize traumatic events or responses in their life? And how does somebody support them
Mm-hmm.
while maintaining healthy boundaries? So that's what I want to cover. And I,
Okay. So for the first steps towards starting to recognize trauma in their life and intervening, um, and this one to me is kind of funny because it seems counterintuitive. But I put the first step towards healing from trauma is to acknowledge you have trauma. Nobody wants to do that. I put in my notes, and it's a really sad situation. You know, as a therapist, you're oftentimes dealing with trauma. I think it's more commonly than not what I'm working on. And I tell people, I've kind of jokingly said to people, both patients and people in the community, you know, I love my job. I love helping people and the installation of hope and moving from a place of struggling to empowerment and freedom is amazing. But the worst part of my job is so often telling people, what you're describing is sexual assault. What you're describing is physical abuse. What you're describing is trauma. That should not have happened. And the number of people that are surprised to hear that, the number of people that say, well, I don't like that word. I don't like that. I don't want to acknowledge that. Nobody does. Nobody does. But by denying it, you create a state of chaos in the present, because crazy is typically a thing that we use to describe something we don't understand, whether it's something super cool, like a guy doing a double backflip on a dirt bike, or some state of functioning that doesn't make sense. Oh, she's crazy. You know, why would she break up with him? He's such a great guy. Oh, he's crazy. Why would he not take that job? Well, very often the answer is trauma. Unresolved trauma is why. If it seems crazy at face value and there's no explanation for it, my brain goes, it's trauma. One of my clinicians, supervisees at my previous job, I was given a presentation of some things in the present, like a case study. And I said, what are we looking for here? And nobody answered. And finally, one of our newest employees was like, is it trauma? And I said, yes. And she said, with you, it's always trauma, isn't it? Should we just always say that? And I said, about 95% of the time, yes, you guys, if you have not realized, this is what we're talking about more often than not, because it's such a significant problem in society. Trauma is still happening. Tons and tons and tons of unresolved trauma. And it affects our physical health. It affects our emotional behavioral functioning. It affects substance use. It affects relationships. This is what we're looking for as clinicians, or should be. Unfortunately, not all clinicians are. But yes, that's what we're looking at. So again, counterintuitively, the first step towards healing from trauma is to acknowledge I have trauma and it's affecting me in the present. The next thing is, you mentioned breaths. Take some relaxed breaths. And a relaxed breath is not necessarily a deep breath, because all the time people are walking around like this, and then somebody comes along and says, you need to take a deep breath. I can't breathe. We slump when we exhale. The relaxation comes in the exhale, not the inhale. The second thing I always tell people is, nobody forgets to inhale. We forget to exhale. Nobody exhales and holds their breath, because panic instantly sets in. We hold our breath in. So I always encourage people, exhale, exhale, exhale. Start feeling that fight or flight system. You start feeling overwhelmed. And what you might find is, if you're constantly having to exhale and you don't have to inhale, it's because you're holding your breath. It's because your fight or flight system is triggering without you knowing it. in order to take a relaxed breath, I should have to inhale first. But a lot of trauma survivors, people with anxiety that I work with, they find that they don't have to inhale. In fact, they can't because they're already holding their breath. And then the last one in terms of simple steps toward healing, if you're doing it on your own, is creating positive, empowering affirmations. Now, positive affirmations get a bad rap because people use them.
Exactly where my brain went.
Yeah. People hate them, but they use them wrong. And this is the non-triggering example I always use for people when I'm talking about a good positive affirmation versus a completely useless one. If I'm stressed out about giving this talk, right, doing this presentation, and there's going to be lots of viewers on there, the statement, "Oh, it's going to be great, you're the best counselor that ever lived," provides me no comfort, no relief, because I don't believe it. That's ridiculous. So there's no measurement for that, right? My brain goes, I don't like that. That's not helpful. And too often, that's the kind of narratives we try to tell ourselves. It's all going to be fine. You're great. It's awesome, but we don't believe it. A better positive affirmation for a situation like this, something that would actually work for me, is this is your passion. You get to share the thing that you're interested in with a whole lot of people. All of a sudden, it flips from nervousness to excitement. Oh, that's true. I love that. Think about the things, think how many people you can help. Wow, that's true. I like that. And then that comes natural. I'm not having to force it. So positive, empowering affirmations improve your day-to-day functioning, but they have to be felt truths. They can't be fluffy, wonderful BS statements. So anything that's empowering creates the acknowledgement or perception of safety in the present. Those are useful, helpful tools.
So we're going to jump into boundaries now.
Yep.
Matt, what is your favorite advice to give about boundaries? Or what's the best piece of advice you can give others? What's something that just doesn't click for people, and when you say it, it does?
That's a tough one. But what I would say about boundaries is they are the key to a healthy life, a healthy, successful life. A lack of boundaries creates every kind of measurable problem you can have. And trauma survivors are notoriously bad at setting boundaries. It's one of the biggest maybe side effects of trauma is an inability to set boundaries. There's a really good article, and I apologize, I don't have the reference for this. I'll try to find it and post it. But really good research article I read years ago on trauma, and the authors of this set out to figure out. They said, anecdotally, it just based on numbers, we know that people who are sexually abused in childhood are more likely than the general public to be sexually abused as adults. But we don't really have good answers as to why. And they did some research, and they looked at different causes, different explanations, and what they came up with, and the authors said that they hesitated to publish it because they were worried about could the information be used wrong. But then they said, we feel like we need to post this. They said one of the biggest answers for why is dissociation. If I'm in a situation of being unsafe and I dissociate, there's no good boundaries being set, right? Now, I'll emphasize what they emphasized. This is not to say it's your fault. This is not victim blaming. That's redundant and ridiculous and absurd, right? There's plenty of victim blaming going on in society. We don't need researchers and psychologists doing it too. But they said dissociation is a problem. You're not consistently setting boundaries. Partial dissociation, even on a very small scale, right? Matt, can you take on this extra project? I'm distracted. I'm sort of checking out. I'm worrying about all the what ifs. And then before long, I'm just going, sure. And I take it. So dissociation is a big part of it. To pass the boundaries, back to the shame stuff. I don't deserve this. I have no right to set boundaries. I'm not a good employee. I have to take this on. I'm not a good boyfriend. I have to do more and more and more and more and more for my partner in order to be loved. And there's no boundaries, and it's overwhelming me, stressing me out. It's constant anxiety because I feel like I have to do more forever. And then it's intermittent bouts of depression because I failed. I didn't do good enough. Big part of why I talk a lot about bipolar having very, very strong trauma connections and fear, shame, and both. Because the mania is overcompensation. I got to do more and more and more and more and more in order to not be worthless, not good enough. But then there's always a crash because it's unsustainable. I can't do those things. Another really good book referencing boundaries is The Stress Pandemic by Paul Hilliach. Love that book
actually
for
bought
integrated
that.
care. Did you?
Haven't read
Good.
it yet, but I have it.
Oh, it's so good. But he talks about stress being essentially the cause of most physical mental health problems. In fact, he talks about a somewhat different stance on things, but he says a lot of times what presents like mental illness isn't even mental illness, it's just overwhelming stress. A person not managing their stress. And there's validity to that, not trying to look at the necessarily controversial question of is mental illness real? But we know that stress affects mental health, right? That's not a question and not a controversial stance. And what reduces stress is good boundaries. Sometimes you got to say to your partner, I don't like that. I don't want to do that. Sometimes you got to say to your boss, I can't take that on. I don't care how much of a bonus I'm going to get. It's going to mentally kill me. It's not worth it. It's going to affect time with my family. It's not worth it. As the trauma survivor, learning to set boundaries is an absolute necessary component of healing. Now, to the second part of your question, though, how do we set boundaries with trauma survivors? An unfortunate reality. But what I put as a simple thing to keep in mind is the same way you do with anybody. And what I mean by that is if we're in a healthy state of functioning, when we're setting boundaries with people, they should be in open, vulnerable, but assertive ways. Meaning I shouldn't be being mean to anybody, whether they're a trauma survivor or not. If my boss comes up to me and says, hey, can you take on this project? Well, nobody would consider it healthy for me to be like, that's stupid. How dare you ask me that? I'm just going to say, no, thanks. I really can't take that on right now. I'm sorry. And so if you're dealing with a trauma survivor, your partner, a friend, sister, brother, it's the same thing. I'm sorry. I can't take that on. No, I can't have you living with me. No, I can't take you to work every morning. I'm sorry. I can't do that. That's not going to trigger and overwhelm them necessarily. Or if it does, they've got work to do. There's an invisible line between helping and enabling. And I say an invisible line because there's no objective measurement for it, right? Excuse me. Are we helping or are we enabling? And a lot of times with trauma survivors, we're enabling. Sure, you can drink in my house even though I don't allow alcohol in my house because you've been traumatized. That's not helping. That's not helping. Cannot emphasize that enough. It's like, no, I'm sorry, you can't do that. Will I pick you up from the bar? Sure. But things like that. But at the same time, I'm going to talk to them about that. Hey, I feel like you're coping in unhealthy ways. I get it. I understand why you feel like you need to, but the right thing to do is to seek actual help, to get some professional help, or to start working on this on your own, because these things you're doing are making it worse, not better. You are absolutely allowed, I would argue, even encouraged to set healthy boundaries with trauma survivors in your life when what they're doing is not healthy.
Is it okay to acknowledge the effects that it might be having on you when you're trying to set a boundary with someone that's been through trauma? You know that they've gone through it. How do I stay somehow supportive, but like protect my peace?
Well, again, like I said, I love Brene Brown, open, vulnerable communication. So is it okay to communicate how it's affecting you? I think that's the appropriate way to communicate. The sort of a growing problem, and this could be a podcast all by itself, in fact, probably a podcast series, is but how is it going to affect them? I think that's a problematic question. And Albert Ellis, who's one of my favorites, the founder of rational emotive behavioral therapy, would say it's an irrelevant question because you don't make anybody feel anything. His famous quote, which was intentionally very antagonistic, was, "You don't make anybody feel anything except with a baseball bat." And I love that because we've gotten to a place where words control. If I say this, they're going to go into crisis. No, Albert Ellis has taught us that that's wrong. But I think a lot of people are scared to acknowledge that or think that it dismisses abuse versus trauma. What I'm saying can be wrong, right? If I tell a trauma survivor, "You're just being weak," well, that's abuse. That's mean, right? It shouldn't happen. But it doesn't necessarily traumatize them or send them into crisis. And we have to differentiate those out. If I'm setting a healthy boundary and that's going to upset them, I'm actually not particularly concerned about that. That's not mine to control. Mine to control is that I have to set healthy boundaries for myself. And secondly, I'm hurting them because I'm not taking anything from them. The example I always use for that is if you yourself are a trauma survivor and you've got a trauma survivor friend who says, "Can I talk about my trauma?" At some point you might say, "Not anymore. I can't hear this. I can't take this." People say, "Well, you got to let them." No, you don't, because you can send them to me. I tell people, this is my job. I love my job. If you can't hear it, send them to us. And it's not just me, it's therapists in general. We love to help people. We have coping skills in place. We have literally a safe environment where we can take that on and not be affected by it. You, their best friend, don't. It doesn't have to be you. It probably shouldn't be you. So you're not doing anything wrong by setting these healthy, open, vulnerable boundaries and saying to your friends, your loved ones, "I'm sorry, I can't help with that." It's hard to hear, right? Yeah, they're going to be a little bit sad, but you're not re-traumatizing them. You're not preventing them from getting help. If anything, you might be bumping them in the direction of more significant help.
That's very good. Did you want to cover anything else?
No, I think that's good. I feel like we covered a lot.
Thank you for spending this time with us on Trauma in the Brain. If today's episode resonated with you, follow the podcast so you'll be ready for our next conversation. If you'd like to support this work, visit ko-fi.com/trauma in the brain. It helps us grow and reach more people.